Okay, so this is just a reminder of what's going to be on the exam on Wednesday. Chapter 43, what was that all about? Behavior, right? Okay, so I want you to be thinking about how well do you remember the items that were about behavior. Do you remember we talked about was our behavior due to our genes or our environment, and probably a combination, and we talked about having an example for each one of those, how behavior is genetically determined and how it can be influenced by your environment. We talked about associative learning. We talked about migratory behavior and cognitive learning. So this one was, is it in your DNA or in your environment, right? Then we talked about communication and the different forms of communication. Blue tells Slate, what are the different forms of communication that we discussed? Okay. Then we talked about behaviors that increase fitness, like territory. We talked about reproductive strategies and sexual selection. We talked about sociobiology and living together. And we talked about altruism. Remember that part? Okay, so that was all chapter 43. Okay, chapter 44. This was all about population ecology. Okay, so let's break that down. We talked about demographics, and we looked at density. Do you remember? And the different clump, whether you were clumped, random, or uniform. Do you remember that? Okay. Get that. Density. Okay. We talked about growth curves. Oh, wait, I should throw in there before we talked about that. We talked about biotic potential. Do you remember that? And survivorship curves. Survivorship curves, which one are we in? We're in type 1. Good. Most of us survive. And we talked about age structure diagrams. Remember, we talked about pre-reproductive, reproductive, post-reproductive, and whether you would get smaller. Then we did the population growth models, exponential versus logistic. Remember that part? Whoever's turn it is, compare and contrast exponential versus logistic growth curve. Okay, then we had a bunch of problems, right? Population ecology problems. Do you think you're going to have one on your test? Yeah. I agree. Then we talked about regulation of population size. Remember there was density, what? Independent and what? Density dependent that could regulate population size. And we looked at R-selected versus K-selected species. R versus K-selected. Yeah. Okay, then we looked at human population. What did we decide would be the best thing to decrease human population overall? What did we talk about? Education of women. Yeah. Okay, so that was behavior and population ecology. So then we went on. Tell your bio buddy, as I switch screens, which of those things do you think you need to focus on? Don't say everything, okay? Which of those things can you focus on? Okay. Now, chapter 45 was community ecology and ecosystem ecology. Guys, ready? So we talked about things like habitat versus niche, right? We talked about the habitat versus niche. We talked about the competitive exclusion principle, right? We talked about things like predator-prey interactions. And we focused on like the cycling or defensive things like hiding. Remember that part? Okay. We talked about symbiotic relationships. You should be pretty good on those, right? Then we talked about succession, ecological succession over time. And then we talked about the dynamics of an ecosystem. And what you want to think about there would be autotrophs, right? Going to what? Heterotrophs. And we talked about producers and consumers. And then both of these are impacted by who? Remember, and we had different types of consumers, primary consumers, secondary consumers. And we talked about how energy will flow, but nutrients, what? Cycle. Oh, don't forget we talked about trophic levels. And then we stacked those for pyramids. Remember that? Ecological pyramids, when we stacked up our trophic levels. Cycling. What are the cycles you need to know about? Nitrogen, phosphorus, water, carbon. Carbon. Good. All right. That was it for chapter 45. Moving on to chapter 46. Chapter 46 was climate and the biosphere. No, it's not bad. So, what did we say? You guys are kind of chatty. What did we say climate was dependent upon? Temp and rainfall. Okay? And we said you could increase your altitude or your latitude, and then you could go through the same biomes, right? We looked at terrestrial biomes versus aquatic biomes. Aquatic biomes are things that are affected by like abiotic things like depth, salinity, movement of water, how much oxygen. You remember that? We talked about freshwater versus saltwater biomes. On terrestrial biomes, when we looked at temperature and rainfall, remember we started at the tundra, said low rain, low temps, no trees, right? Then we went down a little bit. We got a little bit warmer and a little more rain, and we said, oh, we have coniferous forests, Christmas trees and Hanukkah bushes, right? Then we went temperate deciduous forest, then jungle. Then we went to extremes like deserts, right, and chaparral environment, and we went through those biomes and the aquatic biomes, and then that brought us to chapter 47 that we did today. Okay? Reviews.